I skipped meals so he could study in Paris, not just once or twice regularly. I told him I wasn't hungry, that I'd already eaten, that I was watching my sugar. I lied with a mother's grace while my stomach twisted through double shifts. I clipped coupons, walked instead of taking the bus, and let my coat sleeves stay frayed another winter. When the acceptance letter came, I screamed with joy louder than he did. He had always dreamed of studying abroad, and I made it happen. Tuition, airfare, deposits. Piece by piece, I gave up what little I had, telling myself love meant you go without so your child can go farther. I didn't even cry when I hugged him goodbye at the airport. I just held his face in my hands and said, "Call me when you land." He smiled, distracted, already leaning into his future, and said, "Of course, Mom." I waited that whole day, checking my phone every few minutes. I pictured him walking through cobblestone streets, calling me with wonder in his voice. But the call never came. I messaged. I waited. I messaged again. After 2 days of silence, I tried calling only to hear that familiar mechanical sting. "This user has blocked you." I thought it was a mistake, maybe a glitch. Maybe he lost his phone. Maybe anything but what it really was. I created a new account. Sent a message. Nothing. I found a photo of him online, smiling in front of the Eiffel Tower, surrounded by new friends. And in that moment, I didn't feel pride. I felt erased, like I had fueled a rocket just to watch it vanish. And all I had left was the hunger I told myself was temporary, now permanent in my chest. The worst part wasn't the silence. It was how quickly it became normal. One day, I was refreshing the inbox every 5 minutes. The next, I was staring at the wall, phone face down, pretending it didn't matter. I told Marta he was probably busy, time zones and all. I said it with a smile tight-lipped, the kind where when you're trying not to fall apart in front of someone who still believes your child loves you back. I deleted the app after a week, not out of strength, but out of survival. The hunger that once came from skipping meals had moved elsewhere now, into my throat, into my chest, into the quiet moments between work and sleep. I still had his old tea mug in the cabinet. I stopped using it. I couldn't hold something he once loved without feeling disposable, and yet I also couldn't throw it away. That's the paradox of being left behind by someone you built your world around. Everything hurts, and everything still matters. I played voicemails of him from years ago, just to remember the sound of his voice when he used to need me. I found old letters he wrote as a boy, "You're the best mom in the world," in crooked handwriting, and reread them like scripture. I kept setting one place too many at the table, out of muscle memory. But there were no more phone calls, no emails, not even a secondhand update. It was as if I had only existed to get him there. And once he arrived, I dissolved. I began asking myself terrible questions. Did he ever love me at all? Did he block me? Or just outgrow me? One would have broken my heart. The other, it threatened to erase it completely. I went to the market one evening and passed by the bread aisle, the same shelf where I used to calculate every cent, deciding what I could skip so he wouldn't have to. I remembered how I'd hide hunger behind humor. I'm on a diet. I'd laugh while my stomach ached at work. I remembered the nights I made rice stretch for 2 days. The mornings I drank only hot water with lemon and called it breakfast, all so he could fill out visa forms. Buy his passport, get the jacket. He said everyone in Paris wore. I never hesitated, not once. Because when you're a mother, you learn to become invisible if it means your child will shine. But now, as I stood in that aisle alone, holding a loaf I could afford again, I realized something I hadn't admitted until then. I wasn't waiting for him to explain. I was waiting for him to remember me, not just as a provider, not as a stepping stone, but as a person, a woman with a name, a face, and a story. I paid for his flight, but he boarded that plane like I was baggage he didn't want to claim. I walked home slowly that night, groceries in hand, and sat at the kitchen table with the lights off. The fridge hummed quietly, the street outside blurred with distant traffic. I whispered to no one, "I'm still here." And for the first time, it sounded strange coming from my own mouth, like a voice from a room no one visits anymore. I had thought the hardest part would be missing him, but no, the hardest part is realizing he doesn't miss me at all. And that kind of absence, it fills every corner of the house. I told myself he would come around, that maybe Paris had overwhelmed him. Maybe it was culture shock, maybe stress, maybe something I'd never understand because I'd never traveled further than the next town over. I wanted to believe it was temporary, so I defended him to Marta, to my sister, even to myself. He's just adjusting, I'd say. It's probably hard to keep in touch, and I'd nod like I believed it, even when my chest told me otherwise. Mothers do that. We lie to protect the ones who hurt us, just so we can keep loving them without shame. I kept his room exactly the same. Books on the shelf, clothes in the drawers, Even that old poster above the bed he used to complain about, but never took down. I dusted it weekly, as if preparing for a return that hadn't been promised. I still opened the window each morning to air it out, still folded the towels he liked, still added his favorite cereal to the grocery list. Even though no one touched it, the rituals of denial became their own kind of prayer. But deep down, something had shifted. Every time the phone buzzed and it wasn't him, my body felt it like a muscle flexing in pain. Then, pretending it didn't, I told myself I didn't raise someone cold, that he couldn't just forget me, that he wouldn't. But memory is strange. It only stays sharp for the people we choose to revisit. And the longer his silence stretched, the more I feared he wasn't forgetting me at all. He was choosing to live a life where I didn't exist, not out of hatred, but out of convenience. And that kind of disappearance feels even crueler, because no one sees it happening but you. I started dreaming of him, not vivid dreams, but fragments, shadows of his voice in a crowded room, the back of his head turning down a street I couldn't reach. I'd wake up with my heart racing, convinced I had missed something important. Some sign, some final message. The line between memory and imagination began to blur. I'd catch myself setting out 2 cups instead of 1, or pausing in the middle of a sentence I meant to send him, forgetting he couldn't hear it anymore. It wasn't just loneliness, it was a slow erasure of shared history, a kind of emotional amnesia that creeps in when you have no one to recall the stories with. No one to say, "Do you remember when?" That's what grief looks like. When the person is still alive, it's not loud, it's not ceremonial, it's dust collecting. On framed photos, it's your name no longer being spoken aloud. It's realizing your sacrifices were written in disappearing ink. I stopped talking about Paris altogether. People would ask, "How's your son?" and I'd deflect. "Busy, I think?" I didn't want the pity, didn't want the advice, especially from people who said things like, "You have to let them go," as if I was holding too tight, when the truth was I was the one who'd been dropped. I wasn't waiting for him to be a perfect son. I was just hoping to still be someone in his life, someone worth texting back, someone worth remembering. But each day that passed without a word felt like confirmation of something I hadn't wanted. Two-face. Maybe I hadn't just lost touch with my son. Maybe I had been replaced by a version of himself that didn't require the woman who once starved so he could dream. One afternoon, I opened the drawer where I used to keep his travel papers, of his passport, his visa approval, his flight details. I had printed everything, highlighted instructions, made checklists. I even included a typed-out itinerary of which airport terminals to follow. He never asked for that level of detail, but I gave it anyway because I wanted to be useful, needed, to feel included. Looking at those papers now, they felt like artifacts of someone else's motherhood, a woman who still believed that being needed meant being loved. I sat there, holding that folder, and felt a strange calm wash over me. Not peace exactly, just emptiness that no longer fought to be filled. I closed the drawer, stood up, and began clearing space. Not in anger, but in quiet resignation. I folded the hoodie he left behind and placed it in a box. Took down the sticky note on the fridge with his emergency number. Rearranged the living room shelves where his trophies used to stand. I didn't throw anything away. I just made space, because something inside me had shifted. I could no longer carry the weight of someone else's forgetting. Love, I've learned, is not about how much you give. It's about whether it's ever truly seen. And I was tired of standing in a doorway he never planned to return through. That night, I made myself dinner, something warm, simple, just enough. For one, and as I sat at the table in silence, I whispered it again. Not as a plea this time, but as a quiet truth. I'm still here, not waiting, not chasing, just here. A woman with an empty chair beside her and a heart that had finally stopped breaking just to prove it still worked. I started walking in the mornings again, but now I noticed things I hadn't before. The cracked flower pots on the Thompsons' porch, the faded bird mural near the school fence, the one lamppost that hummed quietly even in daylight. When you stop listening for someone else's voice, you start hearing your own surroundings. I didn't bring my phone. I didn't count steps. I just moved. Sometimes with music, sometimes with silence. On one of those mornings, I passed a community board outside the library. A flyer caught my eye: creative writing for beginners, Tuesday evenings, free. For a moment, I stood there, frozen. I hadn't written anything in decades, but something about the idea, room full of quiet people making sense of their own stories, felt like oxygen. That night, I signed up. Not because I had something to say, but because I was tired of being someone who was only spoken through. The first class was small, 6 women, 1 man, all older, all a little shy. We wrote prompts about moments that changed us. My hands shook when I started, but the words came, slowly, then steadily. I I wrote about an airport, and when I read the last line aloud, the room stayed quiet still, but not empty. Afterward, one woman touched my arm and said, "That felt real." I nodded, swallowing something I hadn't named yet. I was writing because I finally understood. I hadn't disappeared. I had just stopped telling my story. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to begin a new one where I didn't vanish the moment someone else got what they wanted. I started filling notebooks. Not with letters to him, those days were gone, but with small moments. Descriptions of light through the curtains, memories of songs I used to hum while cleaning, grocery store encounters with strangers who smiled for no reason, the kind of things I had always brushed aside in service of someone else's big life. Now, they were mine. Quiet evidence that I was still living. I took the bus downtown one afternoon and wandered into a secondhand shop. Found an old teacup with a crack down the side, delicate, imperfect, beautiful. I bought it and placed it on my windowsill. Not to use, just to see. A reminder that some broken things still deserve to be displayed. Marta noticed. "You seem lighter," she said. I didn't answer right away, because how do you explain the strange kind of peace that comes from no longer begging to be loved? From realizing you were never meant to starve for someone else's dreams. I smiled and poured UST. And in that moment, I realized I hadn't mentioned his name in days. Not because I'd forgotten, but because he no longer occupied every inch of my internal space. There were other rooms now. Rooms with my voice on the walls, not just his echo. I went back to the writing class. I submitted a short story. The teacher read a line aloud. She learned to live on silence until she realized silence had never fed her. I embraced it, because for once, the silence wasn't coming from someone else. It was full of all the things I had left to say. Now that I had finally stopped waiting for permission to speak, one evening I lit a candle and sat at the table with no plans, no phone beside me, no distractions. Just a pen, a fresh notebook, and the hum of my home. I wrote a single sentence at the top of the page. "This life is mine now." I let it sit there, staring back at me, daring me to believe it. And slowly, word by word, I began writing the parts of myself I had buried under grocery lists, tuition bills, and airport farewells. I wrote about being a woman before being a mother, about the dreams I had as a girl, about the places I still wanted to see, the kind of awake that stings at first, like sunlight in tired eyes. The tiny rosemary plant on the counterrand felt something I hadn't known in years. Ownership. Not just of my house, but of my time, my thoughts, my hunger, finally fed by something other than hope. I didn't stop loving him. That kind of love doesn't vanish. But I stopped placing it at the center of every decision I made. I stopped wondering what he would think or whether he would ever apologize. Some wounds don't close with words. Some wounds close when you stop expecting them to. I went to bed that night with the windows open. Just the quiet assurance that even if no one else called my name, I still remembered it, and that was enough. I was no longer the mother who sacrificed everything. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. Thin, white, international stamp in the corner. My name was written in his handwriting, slightly messier than I remembered. For a moment, my fingers hovered over it, uncertain whether to open or throw it away. In the end, I slid my thumb beneath the flap and unfolded the single sheet inside. It wasn't an apology, just a brief update. School was going well. Paris was beautiful. Things were busy. At the end, he wrote, "Hope you're okay. Thanks for everything." No signature. The words landed like a sigh in my chest. Polite, safe, detached. He could have sent that same sentence to a host family, a teacher, a stranger who once gave him directions. I folded it back up, sat down at the kitchen table, and stared at the wall for a long time. Not angry, not shattered, just done. Done with being the background character in my own story. That evening, I opened the drawer with the house documents. The deed was still in my name. The emergency contacts, the savings I had rebuilt slowly, meal by meal. I took out a blank form and began filling in a trust, quietly, not out of revenge, but out of respect for myself. I wrote my name clearly alone. I didn't include his. Not as punishment, but because I had finally learned the cost of investing everything in someone who disappears the moment they arrive. When I signed the last page, I felt something settle in my chest. Not triumph, not spite, just truth. The kind that doesn't need to be spoken to be real. The framed photographs, the quilt I stitched by hand, the bookshelf filled with titles I once read aloud to him before bed. Each item had a story. Each one had been preserved like a gift waiting to be received. But now, I saw them differently, not as legacy, but as testimony. Proof that I was here, that I loved, that I built something beautiful, even if it went unclaimed. I dusted the surfaces with care, rearranged the framed photo of my parents, moved my favorite mug to the front of the cabinet, lit a candle just for me. I opened the windows wide and let the spring breeze sweep through the rooms, as if giving the house permission to exhale. For so long, it had been holding its breath, just like me. I didn't remove his things in anger. I placed them in a box, gently wrapped in fabric, labeled with the date, not to erase him but to separate my present from a memory that no longer served me. I stored the box in the attic, out of reach but not out of existence. Then I made tea, sat by the window, and when the phone buzzed his name on the screen, I let it ring 5 times. Then stop. No voicemail, no message. Just another moment. Offered and not held. I didn't cry. I didn't feel triumphant either. I simply returned to my cup and my breath. Because healing doesn't always sound like joy. Sometimes it sounds like nothing. Like the stillness of a woman who finally realized she was never required to prove her worth through absence, or love through starvation. She could just be, and being, finally, was enough. That night I wrote a letter I never intended to send. Not out of spite, but as a ritual. A final unspoken goodbye to the version of me who waited by the phone, who checked time zones before sleeping, who translated silence into hope. I wrote plainly. I told him how I used to skip meals so he wouldn't have to worry. How I rationed food and dreams and never let him see it. How I cheered for him louder than anyone, louder than even he deserved, because I believed that's what mothers were supposed to do. I didn't ask for anything in return. Not love, not recognition, just space to matter. I folded the letter and placed it in the back of my journal, behind pages filled with stories no one else would ever read. Then I turned off the light, made myself a bowl of soup, and sat outside. The stars were clearer than usual, the air cool but not sharp, and for the first time I felt time moving without dragging me behind it. I wasn't catching up to anything anymore. I was simply here, breathing, alive. He might reach out again one day, maybe years from now, maybe never. And if he does, I won't be angry, but I also won't be empty, because I've refilled all the places where his absence used to echo. Not with noise, but with care. For myself. For the woman I kept postponing. And if that day never comes, I'll still be okay. Not because I moved on, but because I moved into my body. My space, my voice. No longer waiting to be chosen by the child I raised, but finally choosing the woman who raised him, and for once choosing her first. Months passed, the seasons turned. I kept writing. I joined a second-class memoir and memory. Each week, we sat in a circle of folding chairs and read parts of ourselves aloud. No judgment, just breath and pages. I wrote stories that weren't about him. I wrote about my childhood, my first job, the way my mother smelled like rosemary and mint. I wrote about silence not as a wound, but as a language I had learned to speak fluently. One day, the teacher asked us to bring in an object that represented a turning point. I brought the old envelope, the one with his short letter. Thanks for everything. I didn't read it. I just held it in my hand and said, "This taught me the difference between sacrifice and disappearance." The room went still. A few nodded. One woman wiped her eyes and I felt seen. Not for what I'd given, but for what I had finally kept myself. I stopped looking at photos of Paris. I stopped checking flights. I started learning French, not for him, not to follow, but to explore the part of me that had always dreamed quietly of new languages. I bought a secondhand textbook, practiced verbs out loud, laughed at my own accent. I was no longer surviving for someone else's success. I was discovering what it meant to thrive on my own terms. The pain didn't vanish, it softened, became memory instead of ache. He had gone, but I had stayed. And in that staying, I built something I never thought I'd find again, a life that felt like mine. Simple, quiet, unapologetically full of me. I no longer measured my days by his absence, but by the presence I had reclaimed. And that, finally, was a kind of joy no one could block. He reached out again on a gray Sunday morning. The message came through, a new account, different profile. Photo, unfamiliar username, but the voice was unmistakable. "Hi, Mom. I'm sorry. Just that." 3 words, sitting beneath months of silence like a single leaf on calm water. I stared at it without moving. Not angry, not elated, just still. I made tea, folded a towel, fed the cat, then came back. And read it again. He had unblocked me, reappeared, but this time it didn't feel like rescue. It felt like history knocking on a door I had already locked, not out of punishment. But because I'd learned to live beyond the threshold, he didn't ask how I'd been, didn't mention Paris. No explanation, no repair. Just a string of words that hinted at regret, maybe guilt, maybe confusion. I didn't respond, not out of spite, but because I needed time not to think about him but to check in with myself. Did I want to reopen that door? Did I want to offer my voice again to someone who once made it feel small? I went for a walk. The air was crisp. My feet felt firm on the ground. And with every step, I whispered to myself the question I had never dared ask in all the years I mothered in silence. What do I need now? Not what does he need? Not what might bring us close again, but me. Here. Whole. Present. And the answer came quiet and simple. Not yet. I didn't delete the message, but I didn't reply either. Because sometimes healing means choosing stillness over reunion. Not because the other person is unforgivable, but because you've finally remembered what it feels like to not disappear when someone else arrives. That evening, I sat by the window and watched the last light fade into the trees. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel broken. I felt still, like someone who had finally stopped holding their breath. I poured a glass of water and lit a candle knot for him. Not for closure, but as a quiet ritual. A way to say, I survived this. I am here. Not as a mother forgotten, not as a name blocked behind a screen, but as a woman who fed someone else's future and then finally turned back to feed her own. I opened my journal and wrote 3 simple words. I choose me, no conditions, no performance. No longer begging to be visible in someone else's life. He might reach out again, he might not, but I would no longer live suspended in that, maybe. My life had too many open windows, too many pages unwritten, too many afternoons with soft light, and no apology needed. I turned off my phone, placed it face down, and listened to the hum of the house. The same house I once believed would feel full only when he returned, but it didn't feel empty now. It felt honest, lived in, held. I stood and walked to the kitchen, made myself a warm meal, and whispered aloud, just once, this is enough. Not because I lowered my expectations, but because I raised my understanding of love. Real love does not abandon you in the middle of your own sacrifice. It doesn't vanish after takeoff. It remembers. It returns. And when it doesn't, you learn to return to yourself. That was the truth I had been starving for. And now, at last, I was full, quiet, whole, and finally home.